Stick around until the end of this video and I'm going to explain to you why the Russian army has practically been obliterated at this point, and now Putin is relying on the poor winter weather to try and keep his army alive until the early spring. Now, one thing that we've seen that's been very clear to many people is that the casualty reports of the Russians has been skyrocketing over the past few months. Currently, they've reached around an estimated number of 92,000 Russian soldiers killed and countless hundreds of thousands wounded. We're assuming that that number is probably around the 170 to the 180,000 mark. Now, one thing that's very interesting about that is that we don't get a lot of backup information and a lot of, I guess you could say, straight up reports to give us an idea whether that casualty report is true or not. But we did today. Putin actually made an address just a couple of hours ago about the state of the Russian military and what they'll be doing, because apparently public fears are beginning to rise again in Russia about the fact that conscripts may be called up again in another partial mobilization. This is exactly on time as to what we were thinking a while ago. After the first partial mobilization of around 300,000 soldiers in September, we knew that there was a ticking time bomb where the Russians would take so many casualties again that a new partial mobilization would have to be called up and more soldiers would be needed to try and reinforce the front lines. And we can see that apparently those fears were exactly on time, because right at the moment we said they would probably be running out of conscripts again is the moment that Putin makes an address saying that they will not be calling up more conscripts. In fact, he said that they wouldn't be doing that at all. There would not be any need for now because they're totally fine. But on top of that, he also made another statement that shows that they are running out of manpower again. He said that the war is going to have to be protracted, and that's going to take a long amount of time. This means that the Russians are going to start fighting at a very low intensity so that way they can minimize the amount of casualties and spend the longest amount of time they need to wait for a perfect opening for them to make, I guess you could say, a fairly good battlefield maneuver. Also, another interesting thing that was brought up today that was completely mind-blowing to look at is that, according to the New York Times, in President Putin's address, Putin has said that half of the 300,000 civilians conscripted to fight in Ukraine as part of a call-up announcement in September were still training outside combat zones, which means that around 150,000 of them are currently still in Russia in training, according to the official Russian government report. However, that means that 150,000 of them are not training outside of combat zones. That means that half of them are in combat zones. And out of all of these, 77,000 of these conscripts are actually in frontline fighting units. Now, if y'all don't know anything about how militaries work, the most interesting thing about military is that all of its manpower doesn't go into infantry and frontline fighting forces. About 1 in every 5 to 1 in every 4 of each, I guess you say, member of the military is part of a frontline fighting unit. The other 3 to 4 of these guys are involved in supporting that one frontline guy, and the other 4 could be doing anything like transporting fuel to his unit, or ammunition, or food, or more uniforms, or winter uniforms, or transporting the wounded, or bringing in reinforcements. There's a lot of things that are involved in keeping frontline units moving. But what's shocking about this is that out of the 150,000 conscripts that have been sent into Ukraine, 77,000 of them have had to have entered combat roles, and they're currently fighting in frontline units. This is the craziest thing, because if you compare that number, 77,000, to the original number of the invasion force, which was around, I believe, 220,000, and we divide that number, 77,000, by 220,000, we get that 35% of the original invasion force has now been completely replaced by conscripts since September. And that may also show that the entirety of their frontline fighting force has been completely obliterated through casualties, both fatalities and wounded total, that they've had to replace the entire thing with conscripts alone. The Russian army is no longer the Russian army. It's the ship of Theseus. Is it even the Russian army anymore? Considering that they have, apparently, no actual soldiers on the front line anymore that were there at the start. All of them are brand new. All of them are conscripts just brought in from September and a little bit early, well, a little bit later on than that. Or is that even the Russian army anymore? Is this just a bunch of random people out there with some guns that are trying to fight somehow, but they hardly even have the training to do so? That is probably the case. And on top of that, we've also seen that apparently there's been a sizable amount of losses in the background on the, I guess you could say, the support side of the military, considering that 77,000 of them are on the front line, that means that out of this 150,000, and let me do the math on that real quick, 150,000 minus 77,000, that means that they've had to replace 73,000 supporting personnel as well that have been taken out of the fight through woundings and fatalities. And this is something that really shows us that the Russian supply lines and the Russian support units have almost been completely devastated as well, considering that they've had to replace nearly half, 50% of the supporting units force inside of Ukraine. That means that so many supply hubs have been hit, so many logistics vehicles have been destroyed, and so many of the personnel have just been outright killed that the Russian supply lines must be in complete shambles. In fact, they must not even exist in most places, and that's why we may be seeing, if we look at the deep state map, no frontline movements all the way from Marikiv over to the Donetsk area, all the way to Marinka, pretty much. And we also see that beyond the area of Lysychansk and north, there's once again no activity up there either. And it may be because these units are practically dying or freezing to death in the north, and down in the south, they may not have the supplies at all to even do anything like a patrol or something similar. We don't even hear of firefights in the Zaporizhia area for the most part, save one or two over the course of a month. And that may be because the Russians are putting up no opposition in that area, and the Ukrainians, while going on patrol, they don't really run into the Russians because the Russians are also not patrolling anywhere near the front lines. They're sitting idly by, waiting for more supplies. And this is just, it's really insane, and you can't go over these numbers and comprehend what this really means enough. I can't even, but 77,000 frontline troops replaced from September to now? That's 100% of their fighting force, at least. Hell, it's even more. Going off of the Russian figure, they have 2 supporting personnel for every 1 frontline soldier. That is incredibly skewed. That's way off base. The normal amount in the US military is 1 to 4. Or I guess you could say 1 out of 5. For 1 frontline personnel, 1 frontline soldier, there are 4 supporting personnel, or 4 supporting units for that 1 frontline soldier. And the Russians are working off of 1 out of 3. That is unbelievable. No wonder they haven't been able to operate any offensive successfully. There's probably not enough supporting personnel to make sure that these frontline forces are able to keep pushing an offensive just from the supply end. Not only that, but they're still taking such heavy casualties due to their poor training and poor strategies that they're having to spend a large amount of the support effort to try and just evacuate the wounded and the dead if they do, and then bring in new reinforcements. The Russian front line is practically done for, and we can also see that once again in the Bakhmut area. If we click refresh on this map, it's now showing the 6th of December right here, and then we go back on the timeline to the 5th of December. Actually, they didn't even update for the 5th of December. That's how little frontline movement there is that Deep State didn't even account the 5th as a day. There wasn't enough movement for it to be counted as a day, because the only thing that they took was another 150 yards right on this major highway going into Bakhmut. And so, yeah, and you've got to think of this. This is something very important. That much movement cost the Russians about 500 soldiers killed. That much. From the 4th to the 6th, over 48 hours, 150 yards cost them about, really, over 48 hours, about 1,000 dead soldiers. And that's the only movement they had on the entirety of the front lines. To move anything any longer for the Russians at this point, it's going to take such a, I guess you could say, exorbitant cost of soldiers alone to take anything that it's not going to be worth it. If it takes them 1,000 dead to move 150 yards over 48 hours, imagine how many dead soldiers they would need to take even the area of Donetsk, the part that they haven't taken. That would take almost the entire population of the Russian Federation at this point. There's no way that they can continue to push forward with these kinds of losses, and also with such a lacking support unit or group behind their frontline personnel. There is no military in the world that I can think of, rather than very backwards third world countries, that work off of a 1-to-3 ratio. Almost everyone works off of a 1-to-4 or a 1-to-5 ratio, and 1-to-4 is even considered really risky and pushing it at that. And it's going so badly, even then, that they're having to replace almost all of them. A lot of these guys, on top of that, the ones that are replacing the logistics units, they're so poorly trained, they probably have a complete lack of understanding as to what their job really is or what they're supposed to do, which even further exacerbates the supply issues that they're having, which further ensures that the frontline units have no ability to keep on fighting as frontline units. It's insane, and we're not going to see any change from this. This is, in fact, going to continue to get worse. And as Putin has declared that the fighting is now going to become protracted, that means that they're only mitigating their casualties, but the massive gaping holes in the Russian military that are currently there will remain until the end of this war. They no longer have experienced soldiers that know how to do their jobs, at least hardly at all. They now have soldiers that have no idea how to do their job. They have very little training on how to fight. They have very little training on how to work everything in the supporting units behind the lines. Everything is falling apart at this moment, and that may also be another reason why the war supposedly is going to become protracted from here forward, because otherwise they're going to run out of, once again, the pretty much completely unintelligent Russian soldiers that they have right now, and they're going to have to replace them again, and with no gain. And so it looks like a pretty interesting situation. It's really leaving me at a loss for words when you really crunch the numbers and look at it. They're in such a bad position. I would be surprised if the Ukrainians couldn't start launching their own counterattacks at this moment and begin pushing the Russians all the way back towards Starobilsk in the northeast, considering how badly things are going for the Russians. But with that, that's the end of this video, and I thank you all so much once again for watching. If y'all did enjoy, please make sure to hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. And also, if you have any additional information that you would like to share that you didn't hear in this video, please make sure to do so, because I love to see what y'all put in the comment section below, and I would really like to take a look at them. Also, if you want to help these small little video projects continue to go on, please make sure to go to the link in the description below to our Patreon and support us there, because that helps me to continue to focus on making these small videos, because that gives me the ability to do so. And so, with that, thank you all once again for watching, and I will see you all in the next episode.